The Guardian says stock markets have seen their biggest fall since 2008 as fears over the virus caused panic selling. Well, the Mirror reports that pension pots have been badly hit by the losses, with those nearing retirement likely to be the worst affected. Saudi Arabia's oil price war with Russia has added to the turmoil on the money markets. That's on the front of the Financial Times. The Metro, meanwhile, reports that social media companies are taking action to try and stop the spread of fake news about coronavirus. And on the front of the Star, Boris Johnson's call for people to act responsibly as shoppers stockpile toilet paper. Bog off, it says. Ella Whelan.
Do you know why people do that? Has anyone provided a coherent explanation for that?
What, particularly toilet
paper?
roll?
It seems a funny thing to...
Well, does it start with people thinking, I might have to put myself into isolation, and then
maybe
people
food,
see shortages on the shelves and worry that they'll miss out as well?
Maybe food.
Well, there's food too, I think, isn't there? Anyway.
There's toilet paper.
Dried pastas with things.
Let's take a look at the Daily Mail, shall we? Their front page, because I think virtually all the front pages there covering coronavirus on their front pages. Stay at home if you have a cold. Now, this is what we were told could be the next course of action within the next 10 to 14 days. A respiratory infection of any kind or a fever the instruction may be to stay at home for a week.
Yes, and I mean, look, on the one hand, you think it sounds quite sensible, and why hasn't it happened yet? And if you do have symptoms that you think might be worse than a sniffle, it's better to, even if you think you're in perfect health, why not try and stop spreading it to other people? Just stay at home. I mean, the second part of it, which is the bit that hasn't been fixed, is what happens when people have to stay at home? I mean, you're still very well telling people that they do have to self-isolate or stay, work from home, these kinds of things. What if you can't? What about the 0 hours contract workers? What about care workers? And the government has changed its tack in terms of, at first it was saying we shouldn't panic. I think being genuinely quite sensible about it, saying we need to hit the panic stage at the right peak time, shut down at the right time so that we don't kind of preempt this. But with news like this saying in the next sort of fortnight, stay at home if you've got a cold, fine. But what are you going to do to support people through that? That's the crucial thing. I mean, we'll be looking later on in the week to the budget, what's going to be announced then. But it's all very well telling people to stay at home. What if that means failing on your mortgage payment, not being able to meet the rent, not being able to feed your family? Those are the important questions that need to be answered.
And the Telegraph has a similar front page headline, doesn't it? Prepare to self-isolate if you have a cold is their main headline. And that is a question. There will be a lot of focus on this budget, the first budget for Rishi Sunak in the job only for 3 weeks, see what support can be offered.
And also, if you're a job in a sort of cosy middle-class job like journalism or website design, you can work from home. But if your job is actually a face-to-face job, if it involves you getting up in the morning and leaving your house to go and deliver a service to someone, to work in a restaurant, to work as a cleaner, to work in anything where your physical bodily presence is the heart of what you're doing, it's a big ask to say to someone, self-isolate. And then the question has to be, how is the government and how are employers going to support people doing it? And one of the things that coronavirus, it seems to me, brings to the fore is all sorts of issues that are there anyway. How do we treat people who are on 0 hours contract? How do we people who are the precariat, who are only just getting by, and anything like that? You know, if there's a fair wind that can kind of survive, as soon as that wobbles, what is there support for them? We have a benefit system, but universal credit hasn't worked very well. What happens immediately as the money dries up? Not in a month's time, not in 6 months' time. What happens immediately? All of these issues that are there, present in our country, they're there, present in America. What happens if you're in a country which has no universal healthcare system and a pandemic strikes? Well, America are about to find exactly that out, which is why you could see the fear in Donald Trump's eyes when he was speaking just then.
And this is also asking, is it not, for people to act selflessly? So someone might have a bit of a fever. They might normally think, I'm okay to go to work, but I need to not go so I don't infect other people who could be in a vulnerable state or one of those vulnerable groups, and it could affect them quite badly.
And that's the difficult thing, because there have been, I generally think that listening to the radio and watching the news and listening to the experts, which we're not medical experts on this, talking about the fact that, you know, the majority of people, this isn't going to really, it's certainly not going to put your life in danger, healthy young people. It's only for people who have underlying health conditions or of a certain age. And so you generally think, well, now what's the problem? I'll still get on the tube and all those kinds of things. But it is about asking people to make those choices, like thinking, well, I won't go and visit my elderly relatives this weekend. I'm not going to get that unnecessary tube journey just in case, not that I get sick, but I spread it onto someone else. But Stig made a good point. Is on the front page of the Mirror here is talk about the fact that British pensions are going to be affected by the fluctuations or dips in the stock market. It raises those questions of, right, do we think it's a good thing that pensions are tied up with the fluctuations of the stock market? Do we think possibly that needs to be addressed? Is there a worry about the fact that the universal credit system at the moment doesn't serve people? It's not to say that it's a positive that's going to come out of coronavirus. That would sound incredibly unsympathetic. But one product of it is it's forcing us to look at some very difficult truths about the way our society is run and the way it's actually not working.
And we've only got about 20 seconds, but there's the Mirror's headline, meltdown and an extraordinary falls in the stock market today.
Yeah, and then you hear figures like, companies now worth £200 billion less than they were. None of it's actually meaningful. I mean, companies are about worth the same amount. They'd only be worth that amount if they liquidated all their shares. So it's a big headline, but that will recover. In 6 months' time, it won't look as bad.
Okay, well, we are out of time, but Stig and Ella, thanks for galloping through the papers
No.
there. We've got more time at 11:30. All the top stories coming up next.
But it didn't look like it.
Meanwhile, on the other side.
Very well. The big decision was early when we shut down our borders. We're the first ones ever to do that. We've never done that in our country before.
Meanwhile, on the other side of America, the cruise liner carrying 21 people with confirmed cases of coronavirus has arrived in Oakland in California. The Grand Princess was held for a number of days off the coast while passengers, including 142 British people, were tested. Well, by the Italian government in a bid to stop the spread of the coronavirus, as the number of cases has risen to more than 9,000. The number of deaths in the country has also risen by 97 to 463. The FTSE 100 has suffered its biggest drop in one day since 2008 over fears of the coronavirus outbreak. And a fifth patient in the UK has died after testing positive for coronavirus, as the government's chief medical officer warns anyone with a minor fever could soon be told to self-isolate. Hello there, you're watching the Press Preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. Over the next half an hour, we'll be talking through the headlines with the journalist and author Ella Whelan and the editor of the Times literary supplement, Stig Abel. So hello to you two.
Hello.
So let's take a look then at what's making the front pages. And the Daily Telegraph leads with the government's warning that people with a cough or a cold could soon be told to self-isolate for a week. That's also on the front of the Express with the headline, Cough, Stay Home Order. The Mail leads on that story as well, saying the government has decided not to take more drastic measures such as closing schools or imposing travel bans. And it's the same story on the front of the i2, which also reports on the 5 deaths in the UK. The Guardian says stock markets have seen their biggest fall since 2008 as fears over the virus caused panic selling. That's also the lead for the Times, which says there's now growing alarm over the impact of the virus on the world economy. While the Mirror reports that pension pots have been badly hit by the losses, with those nearing retirement likely to be the worst affected. Saudi Arabia's oil price war with Russia has added to the turmoil on the money markets. That's on the front of the Financial Times. The Metro reports that social media companies are taking action to try and stop the spread of fake news about coronavirus. And on the front of the Star, Boris Johnson's call for people to act responsibly as shoppers stockpile toilet paper. So Ella Whelan and Stig Abel here with me, and all the papers leading on coronavirus.
Lucky for you, you've got 2 people who studied English literature at university.
Not strictly scientists.
No, so
No.
If anyone can tackle the virological aspect of this, it is the 2 of us, I feel.
Yeah, I feel like, what was it? This is how little I know about sport. Is it Jurgen Klopp?
Yeah.
Who said, don't ask me about coronavirus. I mean, you are going to have to ask us about coronavirus, but I do feel like...
He also said, I wear a
don't know
baseball
anything.
cap and I don't shave very well. And
Yeah, you're
I'm
one away
those.
from
I'm
that.
You've
one
taken
of
the cap off.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
everything.
The cap's off. But
Okay, well, let's
Yes.
go
let's
through
give
the
that a go anyway. You want to talk us down?
Front of the Daily Mail. Stay at home if you have a cold. Now, this was a news conference given by the Prime Minister and his two experts today, suggesting that we could be imminently in a stage where, should you have a cold or respiratory infection or a cough, you might have to self-isolate for a week.
Which sounds like sensible advice. If we've got the context to this is that Italy is currently now in lockdown because there's been such
The
a
whole
surge in-
country rather than just the north, yeah.
Yes, because there's not only been such a surge in confirmed positive cases, but also in deaths. And so you think, okay, things seem to be ramping up. We've had discussions over the last few weeks or so about when we're going to hit this peak period, when it's going to be time to essentially shut down the UK. And this suggestion of people self-isolating, using their common sense and deciding, even if they think, if they're unsure in a grey area of how they feel, to do something about it and self-isolate. Obviously, the question is, what happens if you don't work as we work as journalists, if you can't do it from home on your computer? What happens if you missing work means that you miss a paycheck if you're on 0 hours contracts? That's the important question there. I mean, just picking up on Boris Johnson's press conference, there's this interesting bit that's written about in the Times in which he's quoted as saying, on the question of common sense things like handshakes or taking yourself off home if you have a cold, he says that actually the reason why you shouldn't shake people's hands is not because it doesn't, you spread viruses that way and spread germs that way. It's because it gives subliminal messaging and body language about the fact that you need to signal to the
This
other
is
person.
pages 8 and 9 of the Times, just so we can see it while you're talking about
Yes,
it.
so it means it's suggesting that basically you need to send body language out to someone else that they should wash their hands rather than actually just not shaking hands because that spreads germs. So the point I'm making is it's hard when you're listening to, especially someone like Boris Johnson or the government, to decide what is the serious stuff from the scientists who are actually saying the reason you need to self-isolate is because this will have a knock-on effect, and what is essentially government spin. We were just watching President Trump giving a rather sober and nervous-looking statement in which you have to figure out what is political manoeuvring and what is actually the scientific route to getting us out of this.
Well, yes, and the news conference was involving, and he referred to or deferred to those two scientific experts with a lot of the questions, and says that science is dictating policy at the moment. So when they come out with the decisions like the one about a cough or a cold, which is also on the front of the Telegraph, this is all down to the scientific evidence.
Yeah, and a lot of this is about trust, really. It's about trust in the first instance. Do we believe the government has our best interests at heart? Are they following the science? And I think the one thing the government's done very well is they've stood there with the chief medical officer and said, what do you think? And you have lots of people intemperately on Twitter saying, why are you not doing more? Why are you not doing more? Look at Italy. Look how Italy are locked down. Why have you not done the same thing? Well, one of the things you could point to in Italy is they have handled this disastrously. They may well have stopped flights coming from China early on, but that gave them a false sense of security. The Mail has this somewhere saying, and instead of managing the inevitable spread of coronavirus, they thought they could shut it at the door. And of course, the lesson is they couldn't. So Italy went from saying, we've pretty much stopped people coming in with coronavirus, to thinking they're already through the door and we've not done enough to check it. Witness Italy now with the highest rate of deaths outside China, more deaths rising all the time. So they didn't get a grip on it. So do we believe the medical advice of the establishment? And if you live in this country and you go and use the NHS, you've got to, haven't you? The sort of social contract we have living in this country is that we accept advice given to us from positions of authority and expertise. Contra some of the things Boris Johnson said over the last 3 or 4 years, we do believe in expertise. We do believe in people saying this is the right thing to do. Then the second aspect of trust is we now need to be trusted ourselves to do what's right for our fellow man and woman, because it might be really inconvenient for me to spend 7 days at home because I have a tickle in my throat. It might mean all sorts of things that I regard personally as important don't happen. And if I have a 0 hours contract, it might be worse than that. It might mean I can't get a paycheck that I need, but I've got to somehow summon up altruism to say, me doing this and you doing this and everyone doing this will ultimately mean we get out of this quicker and with fewer consequences, and that's better for everybody.
And also that sense of personal responsibility also is relevant when you're talking about decisions on when you decide to shut down gatherings of large numbers of people, when you potentially shut down schools or universities, or make those bigger decisions, because the experts seem to be saying if you do it too early, it doesn't necessarily have an effect at the beginning, and you lose the momentum. People can't do it for too long. It's not going to be so effective, so you have to introduce it at exactly the right time. That's what they seem to be saying.
Yeah, and part of the difficulty in all of this is that you do have to remember that not everyone that gets the coronavirus is going to even be drastically sick. They say that the vast majority of people who are young and healthy, or simply not of a certain age and not suffering from underlying health conditions, you might not even realise you've had it. It might be so mild. And so the other side of this, the kind of flip side of this coin is, what you don't want to have is promoting a kind of culture of fear and a panic. Elsewhere, I think, on some of the front pages, there's, the bog-off headline about people stockpiling toilet paper.
That's on the front of the Star,
hand sanitizer and that kind of thing, which is the sort of silly end of it. But I think on a broader point, we have, and I'm going to do it, I'm going to bring Brexit into this. We've had for many years discussions now about kind of fearful politics, culture of fear. What happens if a no deal happens and suddenly there's economic Armageddon and we all have to be stockpiling toilet paper and this would be dreadful. And now, when we've got this very serious issue with coronavirus and people are stockpiling toilet paper, you've got a huge amount, I've been looking at it on social media, there's been a huge amount of kind of fun poking and mickey taking and, aren't people so ridiculous to go into Tesco and, flood the pasta aisles. But actually, this is what happens when you have a general sense of society that's prone to panic, stock markets crashing, uncertainty being essentially the rule of the day, when really you'd want a government to take a more sober approach. And I think it has taken a more sober approach throughout. You're right, it has said, right, let's not jump the gun here. And the suggestion that people stay home if they've got a cold, at this point you think maybe it's sensible, but you would always be trying to err on the side of allowing people to live their daily lives as best as they can without any disruption.
And the government has said that it's talking to supermarkets. They're thinking of relaxing the laws, allowing late-night deliveries to supermarkets, trying to make sure that shelves are stocked. Let's have a quick look at the Metro as well, because as you say, trust is important, and they're suggesting that there's going to be an attempted clampdown, at least, on some of the myths and untruths that are circulating.
One of the things that strikes me a lot about coronavirus generally is what it brings to the surface issues that already exist. So one of the issues is fake news. So how that's promoted by on social media accounts, Google and Facebook and Twitter, where someone can just pretend to be representing a hospital. I think it's happened today, and saying a hospital's been shut down because of coronavirus is not true, but people just say these things. That exists whether coronavirus exists or not. The problem of 0 hours contracts, where people are living as a precariat and they're not sure where the next paycheck's coming from. That exists already, but it comes to the surface with coronavirus. Look at America. Donald Trump, the fear in his eyes as he realizes, A, he's not prepared well enough for a pandemic, B, the economy that he's really rested his entire political future on is in danger of slipping into recession. The underlying issues in the American society are there anyway. Coronavirus brings them to the surface. When his Democratic opponent says, what about universal health care? It becomes an even more pertinent point where people cannot be treated if they are poor in America. People who are on 0 hours contracts in America cannot get a paycheck if they don't go to work, if they do the right thing and self-isolate. So those tensions that are in all our societies come to the fore with coronavirus, and it makes us think more about how we should be living our lives. And one of the things we've been talking, Ella and I, earlier on, and I think it comes everywhere, is when we get through this, and we will get through this, and this will be managed, and we will know someone who dies, probably. All of us will know someone by the end of this who loses their life because of coronavirus. So it will be a painful and brutal and heartbreaking next few months for everybody. We'll have to start asking questions about what sort of life we want to live, what our relationship to work is, and all sorts of other deep-seated questions about the way things should be.
It's also mentioned on the front page of the Times and the Guardian, the news about the stock market crash.
I think it's also on the front of the Mirror as well,
yeah,
which is one we happen to have available. But yes, you're right, it's on all of this.
It's addressing that, the point that Sig makes about what a future might look like, but also not allowing coronavirus to rewrite the present or the past. So the question of the economy, whether or not coronavirus had come along, it was not in rude health. We've had, to bring on Brexit again, we've had years of discussion about the economy kind of basically being on the brink of collapse based on the decision of one EU bureaucrat or one British politician. So the idea that the danger would be to paint the events of the next few months and years post-coronavirus as simply all down to this pandemic, simply all down to this virus, when actually the key point is that it brings to the surface lots of underlying problems, the main one being that the British economy certainly is in very bad health and needs very big changes, and the fact that it isn't going to, I think probably isn't going to be able to cope very well with this virus and isn't going to be able to support workers, and lots of questions are going to be asked, means that, virus aside, we need to make some big changes in society that this issue has brought to a head.
And of course, the government narrative is it's in good shape, and we'll hear from the Chancellor this week with his budget of some of the measures to support the economy. We shall wait and see.
But we may need to think about things like how much we fly. I mean, the other thing it brings to the surface, what's our relationship to the global supply chain? Do we have too many things brought cheap from other countries that come into our economy? Do we fly too much? Do we work in offices when we could work from home? We could re-establish how we regard all sorts of things at the end of it.
Raises so many issues. Okay, we're going to take a break right now, though. Coming up after the break, the EU could offer €6 billion to Turkey to keep migrants out. More about that coming up after the break. Watching the press preview with me tonight, journalist and author Ella Whelan and the editor of the Times literary supplement, Stig Abel. We're going to turn to the front page of the Telegraph just for a small story. It's dominated by coronavirus, but there's a story there at the bottom that you spotted at the situation in Turkey as far as migrants is concerned. So what's this development?
Yes, a small part of the front page, but a very important story and something that needs to be watched in terms of, aside from coronavirus, what is ongoing is our discussions with the European Union and the whole question of Brexit and how it's going to play out. And this is just a reminder, myself as a Brexiteer, I like to bring up these things to show that the characterisation of the European Union as this very fluffy, nice, pro-migration, open borders kind of institution is actually a falsity. We see here that the EU is negotiating with Erdogan and Turkey millions of pounds in order for him to basically stem migration and keep people in Turkey and keep people from entering Fortress Europe. And the problem with that is that we see the introduction of camps, basically people living in squalor in these areas, and an occasion some pretty authoritarian crackdowns.
But a lot of Brexiteers would want the
EU
EU to do this, wouldn't they?
I think that I think there's no evidence to show that Brexiteers want to have a situation in which you create a kind of fortress Europe or a fortress Britain. That actually most people are quite positive in relation to the question of immigration, but it's about how it's controlled.
Do you think Brexiteers would say we want more refugees coming towards Europe to come into Britain directly rather than going into...
I don't know about... I'm very pro...
I'd say that's pretty unlikely.
I'm very pro the idea of being open with our borders, and I'm not characterising myself as all Brexiteers. But the point I want to make is, people need to remember in these discussions going forward about how we work out our immigration policy, how we work out a relationship with the European Union, that this characterisation of the European Union as a wonderful, open, friendly organisation, institution, is a nonsense, because it operates specifically on its immigration policy. It has what I would call racist immigration policies, and it operates on the basis of dealing with corrupt politicians like Erdogan to basically stem migration. And I mean, that is pretty bad if it comes to...
One of the central arguments that the Brexiteers, including Nigel Farage and Dominic Cummings, levied was that Turkey was going to join the EU. That was one of the three major messages in the run-up to the referendum. That, of course, could only happen if Britain didn't exercise its veto to stop them. So it wasn't true. So, the spectre of Turkey raises all sorts of ghosts of the referendum campaign, I would say.
Okay, let's move on.
This is about the European Union's relationship with Turkey, not ours.
Okay, let's move on to a story in Times. Which,
yes, it's a good headline.
It's a good. Well, it's all I've read, so you'll have to explain. Nifty over 50s need more sex scenes.
Why are they called nifty?
I don't know. I'm the only over 50-year-old here, let's be honest.
That's the most shocking event of the whole, even you're over 50.
This is why we like you so
much. Exactly. It's true, though.
All right,
everyone at home will be going, really? Anyway, So there's the question of, is there enough sex showing over 50s? And Amanda Redman, who's an actress who's 62, says there aren't that many programs that show it. And actually, there's a couple of reports out which I've read generally, which shows the group of people most discriminated against in the creative industries. It's not women, it's not people from an ethnic minority, it's older people and disabled people are the two greatest. But older people, there's just not very many old people seen on screen
And is it
generally.
her argument that she just wants it to be normalised? It's not just young people that...
Well, she says that there's a huge... The article mentions Love Island and shows like that and says, there's a huge amount of sex going on for young people, why not for older people? Actually, as a big fan of Love Island, I'd like to point out that you never get to see the sexual scenes in there anymore, and that's not me being kind of like a pervert.
Is that disappointing?
But essentially, I think actually, on a more broader scale, we've gotten a lot pruder when it comes to...
I'm going to have to stop you, not because you're talking about sex scenes, I promised. I'm
We're
not
going to show a
being
picture
rude,
of Daniel. We're going to show a picture of Daniel Craig with his top off.
We could show it quickly,
Show
but
a
we've got
picture of
time to...
Daniel. No.
Well, maybe next time.
If you're interested, just Google Daniel
Oh.
Craig with his top. He's 52. There you go.
And so why are we
He
showing
looks
this?
almost as good for his age as you, Anna. That's two 50-year-olds who look good. So anyway, he's showing his lovely muscles. And if you like that sort of thing, you'll like that sort of thing.
Okay, I'm not quite sure why we're looking at that, but anyway.
Why not?
Why not? Okay,
He's a nifty over 50.
we're out of time. Ella and Stig,
Shut
thanks
up.
both very much indeed. Top stories coming up next.